Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone that has joined our economic update with Peter Linneman. Dr. Peter Linneman is a Graham Partners operating executive and Albert Sussman Emeritus Professor of Real Estate, Finance, and Public Policy at the Wharton School of Business. Thanks, Peter, for taking the time, and I'll hand it over to you.
Well, I wish we were conducting this under more pleasant circumstances, but it is what it is. I think everybody knows a lot. I'm going to just sort of walk through some slides that'll be different than the normal we do, because I thought the normal slides we do are just largely irrelevant. What they would show is that the economy was really doing great through the first week in March, and then went to hell. So it certainly has been a challenge since then to figure out what's going on in the economy. And I did my first presentation, if you will, take you through a bit here of what we've got. Can you advance? Let's see. There we go. So I want to just reflect on where we were the first week of March. And it's easy to forget these things. First week of March was the largest, most prosperous economy in the history of the world. We had a 3.5% unemployment rate. We had 157 million people employed, only 5 million unemployed. That week, we had registered a record low of 210,000 new unemployment claims. GDP had grown at a mediocre 2.2%, but it was on the largest economy ever. We had the highest household wealth there ever. We were undergoing the longest economic recovery in the history of the United States. Our industrial output had been flat for about 2 years, but it was at a quite high level. We had record levels of tourism and leisure activities. We had very high consumer and business confidence, and it was showing in retail sales that were at record highs. Single-family housing starts, which we followed for a long time on their slow upward climb, were actually getting within sight of normal. They weren't normal, but they were getting in sight, and there was actually hope that by maybe late this year, it would almost be back to normal. There were very few signs of consumer or business excesses. Yes, businesses had borrowed a lot, but when you looked at it in terms of cash coverage ratio, interest coverage ratios, they were quite strong because you could borrow more and still cover given the low interest rates. And on my canary chart, we still had about half the canaries alive. I mean, we weren't early in the cycle, but there was still room to go. Let's proceed to the next slide, please. And you could see this was the canary chart where there were about half living, half dead. But what I had to add that I had never dreamed of was the last one, which is the corona-driven shutdown. And it's important to distinguish the coronavirus and its impact on the economy and a shutdown and its impact on the economy. And the impact of the shutdown is what's really happened. And I'm going to come back to that in different ways. We have never shut an economy down before. It was not surprising that a place like China, a very authoritarian place, shut down its economy. It's not so unhappy to imprison its own people. It's probably got 1 million Uyghurs being imprisoned simply because of their religion, being re-educated because of their religion. And what we saw was, with the exception of Sweden and Switzerland and a couple of places, massive political groupthink across the world that said shutting down the economy is the right response. Go to the next chart. So where are we today? And when I say today, I mean literally as we speak here. So the numbers I'm going to tell you about GDP and employment and so forth are my best estimates. Now remember, the actual data lags notably. Even the unemployment claims that will come out this Thursday morning are about the week that ended Wednesday last week. And of course, as you know, much more unemployment has occurred in that week, et cetera. So the most recent unemployment claim number we have is actually about 2 weeks ago. So my estimates are that GDP is down 4%, which is about $860 billion. Now, it's important for me to point out that that's not an annualized number. That's not it's down by an annualized amount of 4%. That's that it's actually down 4% from the end of the first week in March. If you annualize that, you're running about 38% or more. And so what we have is huge loss. Remember, GDP is only 21 trillion, a little higher. It was 21 trillion. And in the period from about March 10th to today, we've wiped out $860 billion of it. Okay, go to the next. Today is we, no, go back if you would. I'm sorry. I wanted to go to the next one. Thank you. We have about 30 million unemployed as we sit here today. Remember, we had 157 at the end of the first week in March. Today, as we sit here, we're going to look back and say we had about 30 million unemployed. We're down to 131 million employed, and that's about an 18.5% unemployment rate. By the way, as a benchmark, the financial crisis had a 10.3 high for its unemployment rate, and in 1982, we had a 10.8% unemployment rate. In 1938, we had a 28% unemployment rate. So this is the worst unemployment and the worst economic downturn since the 1930s by far. That is to say, we're nearing double the unemployment rate of the financial crisis, and it all happened instantly when you shut down an economy. About 40% of the businesses in the economy have had zero revenue for the last 7.5 weeks. Zero. If you think about that versus a normal economy, Vegas is open. It's not doing as well as it did during a good economy. Disney is open. It's not doing as well as it did in a great economy. Hotels are open with lots of people there. They're just not as many as in a good economy. Right now, they are empty. And they're empty not because people did not choose to travel. They're empty because they were told they could not be there. And that's an important thing to bear in mind. There would have been less travel. There would have been fewer people going to Disney, etc. But it would not have ceased, and we'll come back to that. Travel, tourism, leisure, entertainment, and most retail have gone to zero revenue. And that has a massive implication for starting this back up, and that every day we wait to start it back up is longer that capacity sits idle. And I'll give you a picture of that. It's one thing to get a casino in Vegas from that was once at 100 and was then operating at 85, back up to 86, and 87 and 88 and 89 because they hire a few employees, they get a few more people come, and they edge their way up. Imagine the task of trying to reopen one of those resort casinos from a standing start. No employees, no food in the freezers, no toilet paper, no sanitizer. You've got to start from scratch. And that's what's going to have to happen. And so it's going to be a much more difficult than normal coming out of things. Every day that we say shut down costs about $20.5 billion. I should have done the math and said during the hour we're going to do this talk, how much did we lose by the shutdown? We lose about 10 basis points of GDP per day. So if you want to know what's going to happen, just take the number of days and keep multiplying. Go to the next, please. Benchmarks. 25% unemployment rate was the highest, and that was in 1932-33. 20% unemployment in 1938. I was wrong. I said it was a little higher than that. Remember, we're already at 18.5 as we sit here today, and we're going to be shut down another several weeks at minimum. So we're going to exceed, in my view, certainly the 1938 figure, and it's even possible, and I think it will happen, that we're going to exceed the 1932-1933 unemployment rate. You see the unemployment rates in 1982 and 2009. During the Great Recession, the financial crisis, we lost 8.8 million jobs. And I've told you we've already lost 25 million jobs in just basically 6.5 weeks, 7 weeks. During the Great Depression, GDP fell by 26.7% annualized. Our annualized rate is running time and a half that, almost. Our annualized rate. Now, we haven't had it for a full year, but it's going to be ugly. We've already gotten 5%, and this is a long way from over. So it's almost impossible to see how we don't have a fall from the beginning of March, which is the relevant time to judge. A year ago is irrelevant. It's the end of the first week in March that all data should be judged from. We are going to have, my guess, in the range of 15 to 30% drop in GDP when it's all said and done. The financial crisis, by contrast, was 4.3%. That took a year and a half to occur. We lost more than that already in 6 weeks. The low in housing starts was 866,000 in 81-82 and 486,000 during the Great Recession. My guess is this next 12 months, starting pretty much from April, we're going to see housing starts in the 200,000 or 300,000 range on the single-family side and about 50,000 on the multifamily side. It's very tough to want to do a home when a third of the population isn't working. Go to the next chart. By the end of April, and this is simply extrapolating out the patterns of employment and GDP. Remember, I said GDP is 10 basis points a day. We will have lost an additional 205 billion, which means by the end of the month, we will have wiped out in excess of $1 trillion of economic activity. At that point, GDP will be down by 7.9%, which is a loss of, as I say, in excess of $1 trillion. It'll be about $1.6 trillion. I think by the end of the month, we'll be running about 35 million unemployed, and 132 employed. Will be up to a 22% unemployment rate, and it will rise higher. Debt defaults are everywhere because if you have no income, it's very difficult to pay your debt. And a lot of companies don't have reduced income. They literally have zero income. by government mandate. Also, the economic linkages are weak. It was very funny. In the beginning, government workers, you talk to them, they say, well, thank God I work for the government. And then think of New York City. I'll take the most extreme. New York City lives and breathes on hotel occupancy and tourism taxes. Well, how much revenue do you think they've gotten in? They've got none. So now what they have to do is face a balanced budget requirement that says, oh, gee, even state employees are going to get cut. Everybody talks about how Netflix is up. Netflix subscribership and viewership is up. But how long can Netflix subscribership stay up if 1/3 of the population doesn't have a job? I just think a lot of that third are going to look at it and say, yeah, I just can't afford Netflix. It's gone. So even something like that's going to go. The graduating class of 2020 is the unspoken disaster right now. Whether it's the high school graduating class, the college graduating class, or the military coming back from service for their country, they're coming back into an economy not only where it's hard to find a job, it's hard to find somebody to interview you. And yes, you can get a job at Walmart. Yes, there are groceries. I'm not saying there's nowhere. But let's be honest. If you've shed 25 million jobs and the bosses, by and large, are working remotely, it's hard to find a job. So you've got the graduating class of 2020 not only facing a tough job market, they're basically jobless and hopeless about finding a job, which is not a good formula if what you're concerned about is social unrest. And I am very concerned about social unrest. I said that again in my first broadcast, which I went back in mid-March, is my biggest concern is huge numbers of unemployed, huge numbers of graduating students having no job possibility is a formula for social unrest. And social unrest usually starts innocently and ends up with overreactions, and those overreactions trigger other overreactions, and it's very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. And I'm not just talking in the United States. I'm talking around the world. And at the end of all this, we're still going to have COVID. We have a lot of treatments under examination. I think worldwide there are 73 treatments being examined. There's a lot of vaccine being explored, but it's a long way to go. I was talking to my friend and co-author at the Cleveland Clinic, Mike Roizen, head of wellness there, and he was saying there's an increasing amount of evidence that it is going to diminish like the flu does as the temperatures and humidity rise. There's increasing evidence around of that point in research, but that doesn't mean it's gone away. There's a chance then it comes back as the temperatures fall and as the humidity drops as we get into very early winter, and we would face it again. So it's not like it's gone, although an important footnote is a reminder that SARS disappeared at about this time and has never reappeared again. So we have to wait and see what happens there. Go to the next. The shutdown. And this is all what if. I'm going to put a couple of things that aren't on the chart because I've done them since. And Tom Hall, bless him, has been amazing also at kind of doing the same sort of what I would call level-headed, let's be realistic about numbers analysis. So Tom, if you're on, thank you for your continued, and Steve also has been steadfast in this. But let's assume, remember, we have a population of 330 million. And let's assume that we save 1 million net lives. And what do I mean by net lives? The evidence is that essentially if you have no pre-existing or identified pre-existing health factors, it's about a 0.5% chance that you die. And if you have one or more pre-existing conditions, it's about a 25% death rate. If you have two or more, not a death rate, 25% have one condition, 25% have two conditions, and 50% have three or more conditions. There's also an interesting number that floats around that in Pennsylvania, over half of all deaths were of people in nursing homes, not people in senior citizen facilities, not independent living and not assisted living, but in nursing. And the typical stay in nursing is somewhere between 6 months and 18 months. And so when I say net, these are people who would not have otherwise died. And the estimates say 50 to 70% of those who have died were going to die in the next 6 to 12 months from something anyway. And so that's what I mean by net. So you don't double count. We have, by the way, 2.85 million deaths a year in the United States. That number has risen about 240,000 a year for the last 6 years as a result of chronic diseases, high blood pressure, obesity, etc. And that increase took us from the lowest death rates in the United States history, which were from 2008 to 2013, back up to essentially the death rates that existed for the first 25 years of my life. I was born in 1951. And the death rates today with corona are essentially, including corona, are running essentially what they ran during the first 25 years of my life. And, people who were older than me were around when the death rates were even higher, and we lived with them. So if it is 1 million lives, however, net we saved, and we lose $6 trillion in GDP from the shutdown, ultimately. Remember, we're already at 1.6, and we got a lot of time to go until we turn this thing around. Because when we stop shutdown, you're still going to lose economy. You're not going to get it back overnight. That would be about $6 million per life saved, per net life saved. The OMB, in their cost-benefit studies, Office of Management Budget, tends to use some number between 7 and 9 million for the value of life. Interestingly, if you're killed in action, serving your country, you end up with around 200,000. So anybody who tells you that society can't put a value on a life is just lying. We put a value on the life of the people who serve us truly on the front lines and put their life at risk. And when it's all done, they come away with about 200,000 in an income stream. Legal judgments come out to about 1.5 to 3 million, depending on the age, etc. However, if we only save 100,000 net lives, that would be about 200 to 250,000, quote, corona deaths. That goes up to 60 million per life. And I think we're at about 45,000 deaths now. But remember, that's gross deaths. Net deaths would probably be closer to 20,000. So it's not to be cold about it. It is a staggering amount of money. And one of the easiest ways to say this is, if you're going to save 100,000 lives out of 330 million people, you cannot sacrifice a 30-year economy. We're not that rich. And it's just common sense. I also just did the following math. And it's just math, there apparently have been 40 to 50 supermarket grocery store employees who have been identified as dying from the virus. And remember, supermarket and grocery employees have gone on working per norm through this. Yes, they're wearing masks, and yes, they're sanitizing more, but they weren't shut down, is my point when I say per norm. And there have been about 40 to 50 such workers who have died or seemingly died from the virus. There are 3.1 million grocery workers in the country. If you think about that, you're talking about roughly 1 in every 100,000 dying, which is a staggeringly low death rate. And in fact, if you said, well, what if everybody had worked with masks? And what if everybody had sanitized? And what if everybody had done what's so unique about grocery workers? In fact, if anything, they have a tougher gig because there's a lot of handling going on. You would think their death rates would be higher. Well, that's the combination of getting the disease and dying from the disease is about 1 in 100,000, by the way. Even if it's 3 times the number, it's 3 in 100,000. That's a number that would come out to much, much, much lower numbers than the 1 million, 2 million, 3 million that you've seen thrown around. And one of the things that Oxford University study has shown, Stanford University is suggesting, studies out of German universities, study out of Denmark universities, all show that the death rates on this are much lower than initially reported. And essentially, the other thing they're identifying is they're not much different than the flu. Now, that's not to say this isn't a bad disease, but we don't shut the economy down for the flu. It is a horrible disease. People are truly dying. It's not a matter that they aren't truly dying. Even if, by the way, half of the people who have died would not have died otherwise, it's still 20, 25,000 people. So it is a serious disease. So I don't want to suggest the contrary, but what I am suggesting is you don't shut the economy down for it. Go to the next chart. We are in the worst economic situation since the Great Depression in the 1930s, since 1938, I would say, to be specific. GDP is well down, as I said. Jobs have evaporated. Loans got called on margin. In the early days, there's been more forbearance in the last few weeks, but in the early days, the mortgage REITs, for example, just got wiped out. Was a replay of the financial crisis where lenders, either with their margin calls or their marks or taking repos back, just shut it down, and they killed. S&P is down as of the 10th when I sent this deck by about 18%. I did not see what the market's at as we speak, but it's down, let's say, 15 to 20%. Since the crisis. Federal debt overnight up 11%, and it's going to go up more than 11% before this is all over. A word about the money. I get asked, well, do I like the stimulus of the government programs, or do I agree with the bailouts? Those of you who have known me over the years know I have always said that government programs do not stimulate the economy. There's no evidence of that. And the other is bailouts are not good things, the moral hazard, etc. This is unique. This is not a bailout, in my view. This is not a stimulus. What this is, much more akin to these programs are, is if I own a piece of land and the government wants to build a school on that land, the government has the right to take that land from me. But under the Fifth Amendment, they also have to compensate me for that. So the government has a right to do things for what they perceive, right or wrong, what they perceive as the social good. But if they do so, they must compensate me. It's a fundamental underpinning. And there's a lot of law around what takings mean. There are lawsuits being formed right now, class action suits that said, what did the government do with my restaurant when they said I couldn't operate? What did the government do with my leisure center, my movie theater, my whatever? All of our businesses that were forced to shut down by the government, and saying that's a takings. And my view of these government programs are that in an odd sort of very rough and ready, not a studied or fair way, but a rough and ready way, it is compensating people for the taking they did, or at least a partial compensation for the taking they did. After all, they took from me. There's no doubt. They took from me. I referred to what we've seen as the ISIS economy. What do I mean by that? Imagine if ISIS had taken over the United States at the end of the first week, or by the way, I could say this about a lot of other countries. It is not unique to the United States. What would ISIS have done if they took over the United States economy at the end of the first week of March? Well, nobody would be allowed to go to movie theaters. Nobody would be allowed to buy the kind of clothes that the girls were buying for the beach at Macy's. No one would be allowed to holiday. Nobody would be allowed to travel. Restaurants would shut down unless they were halal. The only thing that would be selling are burqas. They would have put huge swaths of the economy out of business literally overnight. All of you know that. Imagine what would happen to our economy if ISIS had taken over. Well, what we had was that type of impact without any religious overtone. And in fact, ISIS may not have been as overreaching. And what do I mean by overreaching? The governments all made the decision of, quote, essential, not safe, but essential. So they shut down, quote, everything not essential. Well, that included a lot of people having non-essential medical. An estimate is that that the hospitals in the United States are losing $45 billion a month in revenue from non-elective and normal stuff. Now remember, the whole point was to, quote, flatten the curve to not strain the medical system. I suspect that a bigger strain on the medical system has been wiping out $45 billion of revenue from them. So what we had was this extraordinary economy. I suspect ISIS would have still allowed elective procedures. I don't know if they'd allowed cosmetic surgery, but a lot of elective, like hip replacements and knee replacements, would have allowed to occur. Rates, continuing down the chart, are near zero. Transactions, as you know, just disappeared. A lot of people walked away from hard deposits. Some are going to try to get it back, claiming force majeure, but they'll do that later. You talk to deal lawyers. There are no corporate deals occurring. There are no real estate deals occurring. Nothing's being bought. Nothing's being sold. Nothing's being built. Some places have shut down construction activity. Some have not. But most have shut down construction activity of all types. And so you've ground to a halt. And then on the last one, something near to my heart, you get the knock-on effects. If I don't have an income, I don't pay my rent. What do I have to pay my rent with if I haven't been able to sell any pizzas, if I haven't been able to bring any sell any movie tickets, et cetera, et cetera? So you basically have rents and loans go quickly in arrears. And remember, the unemployment rate is probably 20.5% as we sit here. So 1 out of every 5 workers suddenly has a true strain. And yes, they can do unemployment. And yes, some small businesses have been able to get PPP loans approved. I've been approved. I still don't have the money. And on a second business of mine, I'm trying to get approved, but my bank is running me through all sorts of hoops, basically trying to keep me from getting it. We'll see. Meanwhile, how do I pay rent how do I pay my rent if I have nobody paying me rent? How do I pay my loans if nobody is paying on my loans? Go to the next. As I say, government programs provided lifelines, but even in many cases, the companies who are getting the lifelines, they're not doing anything. And I'm not blaming, here's money to not do anything, essentially, is what's happened in many cases. Consumers are getting money through these programs and will get money. The question is, are they going to hoard it? Are they going to pay their rent? Are they going to pay their credit card bill? Are they going to pay their student loans? And we won't know. In April, before most people got checks, we found out that between 65 and 97% of people paid their apartment rent. The places that didn't pay their apartment rent were the very high rent places like California. People seem to. We'll see what happens in May. What do people have to spend it on? I mean, am I going to buy a gorgeous bathing suit or a gorgeous work clothing to sit in my home? I can do that in sports clothes. And whatever these programs are doing, they do nothing to address the problem of the class of 2020 graduating. They don't qualify for unemployment. They don't qualify for business loans. They don't qualify for anything. Now, forbearance, this time the banks, I mentioned for about a year and a half that the difference during the next downturn, which was now, the next downturn will be that banks have much more capital cushion, statutory capital cushion, such that even if people don't pay them, they still have capital adequacy. They'll suffer cash flow, but they still have capital adequacy. They're able to forbear. They're able to not have to have fire sales on their collateral. That seemingly is setting in, particularly with the Fed happening. However, business confidence is plunging. You ain't seen nothing yet, as they would say. The data on business confidence has just come out. We'll look back at the last numbers and say, boy, that wasn't that great. It was only down 8%. Same on consumer confidence. Consumer confidence is plunging. It's hard to be confident if a third of you aren't working. Many business owners are going to call it quits. And I think the way to think about that is think about the person 60 to 70 years old. There are a lot of those boomers who had a business, a restaurant, a hair salon, go right down the list. And for the last couple of years, they've been saying, should we quit? Should we give it up? The time to retire. And they say, no, business is too good. I'm not walking away when it's this good. Well, now they've been shut down. The government shut them down. And if they open, it's going to be difficult for at least a year. Could be difficult for a couple of years. They have to hire people back. They're probably going to negative cash flow this year anyway if they try to get it back. And I can just see a lot of those small business owners saying, I'm done. I'm just done. And you say, well, how does that matter? There's a little Mexican restaurant we go to for lunch near my office by Jefferson Hospital that's done a fabulous business for years. And the owner basically is exactly what I just described. And his point is, I think I'm done. Now, we'll see if he really is when we come out of it. And it means that someday there'll be a restaurant there. It may not be a Mexican restaurant, but someday there'll be a restaurant. But the fact that there's no restaurant there because he's done means those employees can't even get called back if people want to go buy lunch there again. That's why I think this takes longer. Replacing will take time. Go to the next chart. What do I think happens in the next 12 months? Hopefully we defeat ISIS. Hopefully there's a very odd thing going on. A very odd thing is that government is this is an old debate, but we're looking to the government to answer what we need to do and what we should do and how we should do it. And the government's going to tell us how to open up, etc. And government, and I'm, again, not talking about the U.S., I'm talking broadly, we're just one of the examples, is characterized as if it's the most informed, the smartest, the most altruistic, and the most well-intended institutions and individuals around. Meanwhile, private are viewed as evil, malevolent, ignorant, uninformed. And that certainly doesn't comport with my experience. And so somebody asked me yesterday, what do you think we should do? What do you think the government should open up the economy? And I said, I think the government should stop, period. They should keep doing research. They should keep disseminating information. They obviously have to operate their subways. They obviously have to operate their airports. But they should let the rest of us decide. The notion that the government cares more about my wife and my loved ones than I do just is false. And the notion that the government cares more about my employees and my customers than I do is just false. I care more about my loved ones. I care more about my employees. I care more about my customers than the government ever will. I will take steps. When I say I mean we individually. Governments come out with one size and then tell everybody you have to fit into that size. The beauty of our economy and the individual liberty unique to our economy is we have millions of circumstances, and for each of them we have a different solution on the best way to deal with it. So when somebody says, well, what's the best way to open up the economy? It's very different for my business, which has 5 people in 3,000 square feet in traditional office space, than it is for somebody who is operating Macy's. And by the way, it's very different for Macy's than somebody operating a restaurant. It's very different for somebody operating a shoe store. And it's very different for somebody who's doing elective surgery. But I think it's essential that we get rid of the ISIS economy, of the all-knowing telling us what to do. We love our loved ones more than the government. We love our customers more, and we love our employees more. And we will come to solutions. Having said that, I think the government's going to keep a heavy hand in all this. The last thing to open are going to be borders. And to be fair, one of the government's job is to protect our borders. I think we're going to see a fairly slow recovery. It's most likely to take 2 to 3 years. I would not be surprised at all if 3 years from now we are just approaching where we were in March 2020, the first week of March 2020. Nationalism is clearly going to increase. You're seeing it in spades in Europe. One of the funny things is you can't catch a break. I'm not political, but I have to laugh. You'll see a commentator saying, well, Trump is being nationalistic and hoarding and not sharing and leading with other countries. And then you 5 minutes later tune in and somebody's saying, well, he let U.S. businesses ship a lot of masks overseas in February. You kind of go, come on. But nationalism will clearly increase. Supply chains will clearly be shortened, not just in the United States. That will play well. The supply chains being shortened will play well to the western side of Phoenix, which will serve Southern California, Reno, which will serve Northern California, Dallas, which will serve the Southwest efficiently, Atlanta, which will serve the Southeast, Chicago, which will serve the Midwest, and the Lancaster to Western Philadelphia to Western suburbs in New Jersey for the Northeast. Those supply chains will tend to focus in some of those geographies. The role of the central government is going to be radically increased here and everywhere. And if we do get social unrest, it's going to really ratchet up. And I wake up every morning praying that there has not been serious social unrest. These are now guesses. If I had to guess, by the end of April, we're going to be around 22% unemployment. I use that as a barometer of the economy. If we're lucky, and then we would have to be very lucky, a year from now, it might be the 7%. If you really made me say, I'd probably say more like 8 to 9%, but I'm an optimist that it might be 7% at best. And by the end of 2020, we would be back to what would be considered a pretty good economy, around 5%. But remember, I'm an optimist. All through this, remember, COVID still exists unless the weather kills it. Time will tell. And so, to me, the lesson has been in history. You don't hide from things that kill you. You adapt to things that kill you. Automobiles can kill us. That's why we use seatbelts and airbags and all the technology that goes into. And terrorists could kill us. And that's why we have all the things at airport security. And so on and so on. We don't stop. We adapt. Worker safety in your facilities. We don't stop because workers get hurt. We don't stop construction because workers get hurt or get killed. We adapt. We try to get better. We try to get safer. We try to learn. But we don't stop. And I think what we have to admit is that COVID will be here, could well be here 20 more years before a vaccine would come along. And remember, even when we get a vaccine, only about 30%, 35% of U.S. adults get the flu vaccine. And if the Stanford, Oxford, German, Denmark studies are right, and the death rate on this is around the flu, I'm not sure you're going to get more than about 35% getting the vaccine, even if we have it, on an ongoing basis. Everybody will rush to get it in the first place. The other thing is there's another nonsensical argument going around, which is we can't open up until everybody can be tested. That's just stupid. We have 330 million people, and you're going to need to test people multiple times in a month because you don't know if they didn't get it somehow and somewhere. That's going to require 700 million tests to develop and implement 700 million tests before we would open up. It's just unrealistic. It's like saying I once could dunk a basketball, but I'm not going to be dunking a basketball anymore. I mean, it's not going to happen. You have to adjust. So, yes, more testing is good. I don't think anybody's against more testing. That's not the point. But there also has to be a realism about what it means. And in fact, the countries that were early and small had the advantage of they could sop up the tests that were available. And the tests that were available, because they had small populations, were large compared to their population, and other countries had not yet started to hoard them. With that, I don't know if that, I think that's the last slide, but go if I have one more. A word on oil. Oil got caught in it's a very odd situation. At the same time that demand is plunging, across the economy, across the world because of shutdowns, the cartel had collapsed. And the cartel had been anywhere from real strong to okay over the last 40 years. And fracking over the last 8 years had really eroded its strength. Meanwhile, Iran and Saudi Arabia have gone to war, and Russia has gotten themselves tangled in its own ways through Syria, and the cartel fell apart. So you had the cartel, which was greatly reducing supply artificially, collapsing. At the same time, demand was collapsing. At the same time, people have been ramping up. And so you just had massive excess capacity. Now, that'll adjust, but you had massive excess capacity. It will be hard to reassemble a very strong cartel. The Saudis and Russians would like to believe that, well, what happened is it'll put all the frackers out of business. But fracking is a fairly incremental business, so even if all the frackers go out of business, it won't be that hard if oil prices get quite high again to come back in. Low prices are helping consumers, but not as much as they should, because you can't drive, you can't fly, you can't do things. So it is helping, but not much. It's hurting producers a lot. So Texas, especially Houston and West Texas, are being hurt a lot. The notion that the United States put a cartel back in place, helped put a cartel back in place, is kind of offensive when you think about it. I remember reading about during the Great Depression, the administration was worried about prices falling, so they forced industries to form cartels, which you know hurt consumers. And that's sort of what's going on here. It's rather odd, but it is what it is. I think, let's see if there's anything more. I think that's it. But with that, I've been posting about once a week or so little talks online. I may not do one this week, but you're welcome to reach out if you want to and hear those. You can get from my brother, Doug, at D. Linneman, Linneman, D. Linneman at LinnemanAssociates.com, the link if you wanted to hear the past talks. And with that, I think I'll stop.
Great, thanks, Peter. So we appreciate you all joining in, and we apologize for any technical difficulties you might have faced, but we sincerely thank you for your patience during these unprecedented times. And we thank Peter for your time too, and we're wishing everyone health and safety.